Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The wax pooled around the base of the candle like congealed tears, and I should have known then that something had shifted in the very fabric of my evening routine. For 3 months, I'd been reading by candlelight, not out of some romantic notion or environmental consciousness, but because the overhead bulb had blown, and replacing it required confronting the landlord about the faulty fixture. Easier to live in the amber glow, easier to pretend the shadows dancing on my apartment walls were merely products of flickering flame rather than harbingers of something I couldn't yet name. The book in my hands, a worn copy of Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, felt heavier than usual, as if the pages themselves had absorbed moisture from the October air seeping through the ill-fitted windows. I'd been reading the same paragraph 3 times, my concentration fractured by a persistent feeling that someone had entered the room without my knowledge. The sensation crawled along my spine like cold fingers, and I found myself glancing up from the text with increasing frequency. That's when I noticed the second shadow. My own silhouette stretched across the far wall, a familiar companion distorted by the candle's position on the coffee table. But beside it, slightly offset and impossibly solid, sat another figure. The shadow appeared to occupy a chair that didn't exist. My apartment held only one reading chair, the threadbare recliner I'd inherited from my grandfather, and I was sitting in it. The breath caught in my throat as the shadow raised its hand, fingers arranged in a deliberate gesture, index and pinky extended, middle and ring fingers pressed down by the thumb. Devil horns, a mockery, a challenge. My immediate response was to exhale sharply, a reflexive release of tension that sent the candle flame guttering. The light dimmed to half its intensity, and in that reduced illumination, the shadow seemed to grow more defined, more present. Its outline sharpened while mine became diffuse and uncertain, as if the thing on the wall was more real than I was. I closed the book and set it on the arm of the chair, fighting the urge to look directly at the wall. Instead, I focused on my hands, pale in the diminished light, trembling with what I told myself was caffeine jitters from too much coffee. The rational mind seeks rational explanations. Perhaps I'd developed some neurological condition. Perhaps the stress from my recent job loss had manifested in visual disturbances. Perhaps the isolation of the past few weeks had begun to fracture my perception in subtle ways. But when I finally raised my eyes to the wall, the shadow was still there, and it had changed position. Now it appeared to be leaning forward, as if listening intently to my thoughts. The posture was so human, so deliberately attentive, that I found myself holding my breath to avoid making noise. The silence in the apartment had become absolute. No hum from the refrigerator, no distant traffic, no settling of old wood. Even the candle burned without its usual soft crackling, the flame motionless as a painted thing. I stood slowly, careful not to disturb the careful choreography of light and shadow that seemed to govern this moment. My movement caused my own shadow to shift across the wall, but the other remained fixed in its listening pose. When I took a step to the left, my silhouette moved with me. The second shadow didn't budge. The candle sat between me and the wall, casting light from a position that should have been impossible to create the shadow I was seeing. I moved around the coffee table, positioning myself to block the light source entirely. My shadow disappeared, swallowed by my own body's interference with the candle's glow. The other shadow remained visible, unchanged, unaffected by the laws of physics that governed the rest of my small reality. I reached for the light switch, then hesitated. Something fundamental would change when I flooded the room with electric illumination. The shadow would vanish, yes, but so would any possibility of understanding what I was experiencing. The fluorescent overhead would transform this encounter into mere memory, something to be rationalized away in the harsh honesty of artificial light. Instead, I picked up the candle. The holder warmed my palm as I lifted it, wax sliding down to pool between my fingers. I walked slowly toward the wall, watching both shadows adjust to the changing light source. Mine behaved predictably, shortening as I approached the wall, darkening as the light source came closer. The other shadow remained the same size, the same density, the same impossibly specific shape. When I stood close enough to touch the wall, I raised my free hand and pressed it against the painted surface. My shadow's hand aligned perfectly with my real one. I traced the outline of the mysterious figure with my finger, feeling nothing but the slight texture of cheap latex paint and the coolness of the plaster beneath. The shadow's head turned to follow my movement. I jerked my hand back so quickly that hot wax spattered across my wrist, tiny burns that anchored me to physical sensation. The shadow's head had definitely moved, not a trick of shifting light, not a neurological misfire, but a deliberate rotation as if something behind the wall was tracking my exploration of its projected form. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The apartment felt smaller, the air thicker. I backed away from the wall, candlelight wavering with each step, creating a chaotic dance of moving shadows that made it difficult to track the anomalous figure. But it was always there, always in the same relative position, always maintaining its attentive posture. I needed to determine if this was localized to my apartment or something broader. The hallway outside my door would provide a different environment, different walls, different lighting conditions. If the shadow followed me there, or if it disappeared entirely, either result would offer crucial information about my mental state versus external reality. But approaching the door required turning my back on the wall, and something deep in my primitive brain recoiled from that idea. The shadow hadn't demonstrated hostile intent, but its mere existence violated everything I understood about cause and effect. If it could cast itself without a physical form, what other rules might it be exempt from? I compromised by walking sideways toward the door, keeping the wall in my peripheral vision. The shadow remained motionless until I reached for the doorknob. Then it stood up. The movement was fluid and natural, exactly like someone rising from a chair to follow a guest to the door. But there was no chair, no person, no logical source for this projection. My hand froze on the brass knob, suddenly cold despite the metal's absorption of heat from my nervous grip. The shadow took a step forward. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, candle flame streaming behind me like a banner. The harsh fluorescent lights in the corridor buzzed to life automatically, triggered by a motion sensor that I'd always found comforting until this moment. Under their sterile illumination, I turned back toward my apartment doorway. The room beyond looked ordinary. My chair, my coffee table, my book waiting exactly where I'd left it. No shadows at all in the abundance of electric light. I stood in the doorway, holding the candle like a weapon or a shield, trying to reconcile the mundane scene before me with the impossibility I'd just witnessed. Mrs. Chen emerged from the apartment across the hall, grocery bags in both hands. She offered her usual polite nod, but her expression shifted to concern when she noticed my appearance. Disheveled hair, candle wax coating my fingers, the wild look that must have inhabited my eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful tone people use when they're not sure they want to hear the answer. I wanted to ask if she'd seen anything unusual, any strange shadows or movements from my apartment. But how could I phrase such a question without sounding delusional? Instead, I managed a weak smile and told her I was just checking something with the lighting. She accepted this explanation with the polite skepticism of someone accustomed to the odd behaviors of neighbors, wished me a good evening, and disappeared into her apartment. The hallway lights began their automatic countdown to darkness, preparing to plunge the corridor back into shadow. I retreated quickly into my apartment and locked the door behind me. The fluorescent ceiling light revealed the space in harsh detail. Dust motes floating in the air, the water stain on the far wall that I'd been meaning to address, the pile of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Everything normal, everything explicable. I blew out the candle and set it on the coffee table, then picked up my book and returned to the chair. But I couldn't read. Every few seconds, my eyes drifted to the wall where the shadow had appeared. Under electric illumination, the surface looked flat and unremarkable, marked only by the minor imperfections of cheap paint and shoddy craftsmanship. Nothing supernatural, nothing worthy of concern. I read the same paragraph 4 more times before giving up and preparing for bed. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of shadow figures gesturing from walls that stretched infinitely in all directions. I woke repeatedly, convinced I'd heard movement in the living room, but each time I investigated, I found nothing disturbed. The candle sat where I'd left it. The book remained closed. The apartment held only the familiar sounds of old buildings settling in the night. Morning brought rational thinking and the harsh judgment of daylight streaming through unwashed windows. I examined the wall carefully, looking for any irregularities that might have created the illusion of a shadow. A stain, a crack, some variation in the paint that could trick the eye under candlelight. I found nothing conclusive, but I also couldn't shake the memory of that deliberate movement, the sense of intelligence behind the projection. Over the following days, I avoided reading by candlelight. I replaced the overhead bulb myself, enduring the landlord's irritation about being bypassed, and filled the apartment with the steady, reliable glow of modern lighting. The shadows that appeared were all accountable: chair legs, my own silhouette, the angular projections of furniture and fixtures. Nothing sat where no object existed. Nothing moved independently of its source. But I found myself checking the wall compulsively, especially in the evening hours when the daylight began to fade. I would catch myself staring at the spot where the shadow had appeared, searching for any hint of its return. The rational part of my mind celebrated the absence of further incidents as proof that I'd experienced some form of stress-induced hallucination. The deeper, more primitive part of my consciousness remained unconvinced. 2 weeks passed without incident. I began to relax, to accept the explanation that isolation and unemployment had created a temporary psychological disturbance. I even resumed my evening reading routine, though I kept the overhead light burning bright enough to eliminate any ambiguous shadows. Then the candle reappeared on my coffee table. I hadn't placed it there. I'd stored it in the kitchen drawer after that first night, wrapped in a paper towel to contain the wax residue, but there it sat, perfectly positioned exactly where it had been during my encounter with the shadow. The wick was fresh and unburned, as if someone had trimmed it recently. The base showed no trace of the melted wax that had pooled around it during my original reading session. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, trying to construct a rational explanation for the candle's relocation. Had I moved it myself and forgotten? Was Mrs. Chen somehow involved, perhaps entering my apartment during the day while I was out job hunting? But she had no key, and the door showed no signs of forced entry. I approached the coffee table cautiously, as if the candle might suddenly burst into flame or reveal itself as something other than a simple wax cylinder. But it remained inert, ordinary in every visible way except for its impossible presence in a location I was certain I hadn't placed it. The smart thing would have been to return it to the kitchen drawer and continue with my evening routine under electric light. The safe thing would have been to ignore its implications entirely, to maintain the comfortable fiction that my mental health was improving and that strange experiences were behind me. Instead, I picked up the matches from beside the television and lit the candle. The flame sprang to life immediately, burning with that same steady, unnaturally consistent glow I remembered from before. I turned off the overhead light and settled into my reading chair, opening the Bradbury book to the page I'd marked. The familiar amber illumination filled the room, transforming the mundane apartment into something more atmospheric, more charged with possibility. I read for perhaps 10 minutes before I became aware of the presence. This time, I didn't look up immediately. I continued reading, or pretending to read, while monitoring my peripheral vision for any suggestion of movement on the wall. The shadow appeared gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. First, just a vague darkness that might have been a stain or discoloration. Then, the suggestion of a human form. Finally, the complete silhouette sitting in its impossible chair. But this time, it wasn't alone. A second shadow had joined the first, taller, broader, with the distinct outline of someone standing behind the seated figure. As I watched through careful sideways glances, a third appeared, then a fourth. They arranged themselves across the wall like an audience, all facing toward me, all perfectly still except for the occasional subtle shift of posture that suggested breathing, waiting, watching. My hands began to shake, causing the book to tremble and the candle flame to waver. The shadows responded to the changing light by becoming more distinct, more defined, as if the fluctuation in illumination somehow strengthened their presence rather than dispersing it. I set the book aside and faced them directly. There were 7 shadows now, arranged in a rough semicircle across the wall. They varied in height and build, suggesting different physical forms, different ages perhaps, different genders, but all maintained the same attentive posture, the same sense of focused observation. One raised its hand in that familiar gesture, the devil horns, the mockery of blessing, the sign that had started this entire experience. Then, one by one, they all followed suit. 7 hands raised in perfect synchronization, 7 sets of fingers arranged in that deliberate pattern. The gesture wasn't threatening exactly, but it carried an undeniable sense of summoning, of invitation, of crossing some threshold I didn't fully understand. I stood up slowly, and the shadows stood with me, all except the original seated figure, which remained in its chair, watching. The standing shadows moved with perfect coordination, mirroring my movements as if I were conducting a strange orchestra of projected forms. I took a step toward the wall, and they stepped forward to meet me. I raised my hand, and they raised theirs. But when I attempted to form the horn gesture they'd been showing me, something changed. The room temperature dropped precipitously, my breath suddenly visible in the candlelight. The shadows on the wall began to move independently, no longer mimicking my actions, but performing their own complex choreography. They seemed to be reaching for something beyond the wall's surface, their arms extending toward me across the impossible distance between their projected realm and my physical space. I felt something brush against my extended hand. Not quite touch, but a sensation like static electricity, like the feeling of bringing 2 magnets close enough for their fields to interact. The shadows were trying to make contact, to bridge the gap between their existence and mine. I jerked my hand back and stepped away from the wall. The shadows immediately returned to their previous positions, motionless and watching. The temperature normalized, my visible breath disappeared, and the candle flame resumed its steady burning. But I could feel them waiting. They wanted something from me, these impossible projections. They'd been trying to communicate, to establish some form of connection that transcended the normal rules of light and shadow. The horn gesture wasn't mockery. It was a greeting, a recognition, an invitation to join whatever community or purpose they represented. I looked at the candle, its flame burning with that unnaturally steady consistency, and understood that it was more than just a light source. It was a beacon, a focal point, a tool for bridging realities that shouldn't be able to touch. Every time I lit it, I opened a doorway to something that existed parallel to my world, something that could observe and reach toward me but couldn't quite break through. The shadows remained motionless, waiting for my decision. I could extinguish the candle, return the room to electric light, and pretend this convergence had never happened. Or I could engage with them, learn what they wanted, discover what lay behind their patient observation. I raised my hand toward the wall once more. The shadows stirred expectantly, leaning forward in their impossible chairs and standing positions. I began to form the gesture they'd been showing me, index finger extended, pinky raised, middle and ring fingers pressed down by my thumb. As soon as the gesture was complete, everything changed. The shadows stepped out of the wall. They moved with fluid grace, emerging from the flat surface like people walking through a doorway made of painted plaster. No longer mere projections, they possessed depth and substance, though they remained completely black, absorbing all light that touched them. They surrounded me in a circle, and I could feel their presence like weight in the air, like gravity pulling in 7 different directions. The original seated figure rose from its chair and approached me slowly. Up close, I could see that it had features, not clearly defined, but suggested by subtle variations in the absolute darkness of its form. It extended its hand toward me, palm up, in a gesture that seemed to request something. I looked down at my own hand, still frozen in the horn gesture. and realized what it wanted. It wanted me to take its hand, to complete the connection we'd been building across these strange evenings. It wanted to bring me into whatever realm it inhabited, to show me what lay beyond the wall that separated our realities. The candle flame behind me guttered and nearly died, as if something was consuming the oxygen in the room. The shadows pressed closer, their patient waiting transforming into eager anticipation. I could feel their desire, their need for me to cross over, to join them in their lightless existence. But something in their eagerness triggered my survival instincts. This wasn't an invitation, it was a recruitment. They needed me for something, and whatever that purpose was, it required me to abandon my own reality entirely. I jerked my hand away and lunged for the candle, blowing it out in one desperate breath. The darkness was absolute for a moment, then gradually lifted as my eyes adjusted to the ambient light filtering through the windows. The shadows were gone, the temperature normal, the apartment empty except for myself and the familiar furniture. I stood trembling in the center of the room, smoke rising from the extinguished candle, trying to process what I'd experienced. I turned on every light in the apartment and spent the night in the kitchen, as far from the living room wall as possible. When morning came, I packed the candle in a box with newspapers and duct tape, sealing it completely before carrying it to the dumpster behind the building. But even now, weeks later, I find myself checking that wall compulsively. In the corner of my eye, I sometimes catch a flicker of movement, a suggestion of watching shapes that disappear when I turn to look directly. The apartment feels observed, monitored, as if something is waiting for me to recreate the conditions that allowed our contact. I've started leaving lights on throughout the night, filling every corner with illumination bright enough to eliminate all but the most basic shadows. But I know this is temporary protection at best. Whatever I encountered that night exists somewhere adjacent to my reality, and it knows I can see it. The question that haunts me isn't whether the shadows were real or products of my deteriorating mental state. The question is whether there's any meaningful difference between those possibilities. Whether real or imagined, they've changed something fundamental about my perception of the space around me. I can no longer trust the darkness, can no longer feel secure in the solitude of my apartment. Sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep despite the blazing lights, I think I hear the sound of chairs moving in the living room. When I investigate, I find nothing disturbed. But I also notice that the shadows cast by my furniture seem deeper than they should be, more substantial, as if something is hiding within them. I've been considering moving to a different apartment, perhaps one with better natural lighting, fewer dark corners. But I suspect that wherever I go, the shadows will follow. They know who I am now, know that I can see them. The candle was just a tool. The real connection was made the moment I acknowledged their presence, the moment I looked directly at them and recognized them as something more than tricks of light. Last night I found myself standing before the bathroom mirror, studying my reflection in the harsh fluorescent lighting. My shadow fell across the floor behind me, a normal, predictable projection. But for just a moment, I thought I saw it raise its hand in that familiar gesture. The horns, the greeting, the sign that something was trying to reach across the barrier between worlds. I've been avoiding mirrors since then, afraid of what I might see reflected there. Because if the shadows can manifest in reflections, if they can project themselves through any surface that shows my image, then there's nowhere I can hide from their patient observation. The Bradbury book still sits on my coffee table, bookmarked at the same page where this all began. I haven't touched it since that final night with the candle, but sometimes I catch myself reading the same paragraph over and over in my memory. Something wicked this way comes, and I'm beginning to understand that the something isn't coming anymore. It's already here. Story 2. The fever had been burning through me for 3 days when I first saw her. I pressed my palm against the window, my breath fogging the glass in erratic bursts. The heat radiating from my forehead seemed to pulse in rhythm with the throbbing behind my eyes, each beat sending waves of distortion across my vision. Outside, the world wavered like a mirage, the elm trees bending at impossible angles, the asphalt streets rippling like black water. That's when she appeared on the balcony across the courtyard. The old woman stood motionless in the doorway, draped in a heavy hood that cast her face in complete shadow. Even through my fever-addled state, something about her stillness felt wrong. Too perfect, too deliberate. She wasn't just standing there, she was waiting. The fabric of her garment seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in my peripheral vision that made my stomach lurch. I blinked hard, trying to clear the haze from my eyes, but when I looked again, she was descending the external stairs with movements that defied her apparent age. Each step was measured, precise, as if she were following some ancient choreography known only to her. The metal stairs didn't creak or groan under her weight. In fact, I heard no sound at all, which struck me as profoundly unnatural. The silence was what made me lean closer to the window. My apartment sat on the third floor of a converted warehouse, its large industrial windows offering an unobstructed view of the courtyard below. Usually the space buzzed with the mundane sounds of urban life, traffic, voices, the hum of air conditioning units. But now, wrapped in my fever's embrace, the world had been drained of its soundtrack, leaving only the hollow rush of blood in my ears. The woman reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward my building. Even from 3 stories up, I could sense her gaze lifting to my window. The sensation of being watched crawled across my skin like ice water, despite the fever's heat. I stepped back instinctively, my bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding below. That's when the others emerged. They came from doorways and alleys I hadn't noticed before, materializing from shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been in the afternoon light. Men and women of various ages, all dressed in the same dark, light-absorbing fabric. They moved with the same measured precision as the old woman, converging on the courtyard's center, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. And they were carrying something. The casket was smaller than what you'd expect for an adult, its dark wood gleaming with an oily sheen that made my eyes water to look at directly. The pallbearers, 6 of them, moved in perfect synchronization, their steps falling in a rhythm that felt both funeral slow and somehow urgent. The weight of their burden seemed insignificant. They carried it as if it were empty, which sent another wave of nausea through my already churning stomach. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, the contact sending a shock through my overheated system. The procession was heading directly toward my building, the hooded woman leading them with the certainty of someone following a well-worn path. But there was nowhere for them to go. The building's entrance was on the opposite side, facing the street. The courtyard was enclosed, with nowhere to exit except the way they'd come. Yet they continued forward with unwavering purpose. The fever made everything feel simultaneously hyper-real and utterly impossible. Colors seemed too saturated, sounds too sharp when they existed at all, and the very air felt thick enough to swim through. I told myself this was just another hallucination, another fever dream to add to the collection that had been plaguing me since I'd fallen ill. But the cold glass against my skin felt real enough, and the growing dread in my chest had a weight that transcended delirium. As the procession drew closer to my building, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. There was a figure walking alongside the casket, separate from the pallbearers but moving in the same rhythmic cadence. It was small, slight, moving with an odd, disjointed gait that reminded me of a marionette guided by an inexperienced puppeteer. The figure looked up. Even through 3 stories of distance and the haze of fever, I felt the impact of that gaze like a physical blow. It was direct, unwavering, and filled with a recognition that shouldn't have been possible. The face was pale, almost luminous in the strange half-light of the courtyard, with features that seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them directly. I stumbled backward from the window, my legs weak from days of illness. The room spun around me, my equilibrium completely shot, but I forced myself to return to the glass. I had to see what happened next. I had to understand what was happening in the courtyard below. But when I looked again, the procession had stopped directly beneath my window. The pallbearers had set the casket down on the concrete, and now all of them, the hooded woman, The 6 carriers, and the small figure, were looking up at me. Even hidden beneath their hoods, I could feel the weight of their collective stare boring into me through the glass. The silence was so complete it felt like a presence unto itself, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. The small figure raised one arm and pointed directly at my window. This was when the temperature in my apartment seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. My fever-heated skin erupted in goosebumps, and my breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The contrast was so stark, so immediate, that I wondered if my body was finally succumbing to the illness that had been ravaging me for days. But the cold felt wrong, not like the chill of sickness, but like something external pressing in from all sides. The walls of my apartment seemed to contract, the ceiling lowering by inches, as if the building itself were being squeezed by an enormous invisible fist. I tried to step away from the window again, but my feet wouldn't obey. Some force beyond my control kept me rooted in place, compelled to witness whatever was about to unfold. The small figure below continued pointing, its arm steady as a compass needle, and I began to understand with growing horror that this entire procession had been intended for me. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. They weren't lost. They weren't passing through. They had come here specifically, following some predetermined path that ended at my window. But why? I was nobody special. Just a graphic designer who worked from home, who rarely left his apartment even when he wasn't sick. I had no enemies, no dark secrets, no reason for anyone to single me out for whatever this was. The fever spiked again, sending fresh waves of heat through my system, but the apartment remained impossibly cold. The contradiction was maddening, as if my body existed in 2 different climates simultaneously. I gripped the window frame to steady myself, the metal so cold it burned against my palms. That's when I heard the first sound since the procession had begun. It was soft at first, barely audible above the rushing in my ears, but it grew steadily louder, a rhythmic scraping like fingernails dragging across wood. The sound seemed to be coming from directly below, from the casket itself. Something was moving inside it. The lid began to shift. I watched in transfixed horror as the dark wood slid aside, revealing an interior that seemed to absorb light like a black hole. The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent, accompanied now by what might have been whispers, voices too low and distorted to make out individual words, but carrying an unmistakable tone of urgency. The small figure stopped pointing and moved toward the casket with that same disjointed gait. As it approached the open box, I caught a clearer glimpse of its face, and my knees nearly buckled. The features were familiar, not in the way you recognize a stranger, but in the way you recognize yourself in an old photograph. It was my face, but wrong. Younger, perhaps, or maybe just emptied of something essential. The eyes held the same color as mine, the same shape, but they reflected nothing. No light, no emotion, no spark of consciousness. It was like looking at a perfect mask crafted in my likeness, animated by something that had only a crude understanding of how humans were supposed to move. The thing wearing my face climbed into the casket and lay down. The lid slid back into place with a sound like a sigh, and the pallbearers lifted their burden once more. But instead of moving away, they began to circle my building. Around and around they went, the hooded woman leading them in an endless loop that defied all logic and geometry. The courtyard wasn't large enough for such circles, but somehow they managed it, each revolution bringing them closer to my building's base. I tried to count the circuits, but the numbers slipped away from me like water through my fingers. 10 circuits, 20, 50. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. The fever made everything elastic, stretching moments into hours and compressing hours into heartbeats. With each revolution, the temperature in my apartment dropped further. Ice began to form on the inside of the windows, spreading in fractal patterns that hurt to look at directly. My breath came in sharp puffs that crystallized and fell to the floor like snow, but the fever still burned within me, creating a war between ice and fire that threatened to tear me apart from the inside. I began to lose track of which sensation was real and which was delusion. Was I burning up or freezing to death? Was there really a procession in the courtyard? Or was this just another fever dream conjured by my overheated brain? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each one spawning three more in an exponential cascade of doubt. But the cold was getting worse. My fingers had gone numb, and moving them required conscious effort. The ice on the windows was now thick enough that I could barely see through it, transforming the world outside into a funhouse mirror of distorted shapes and shadows. Only the sound remained constant. The endless scraping from the casket, the whispered voices that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. I tried to turn away from the window, to retreat deeper into my apartment where logic might reassert itself, but my body refused to respond. Every muscle felt locked in place, as if I'd been frozen solid while still somehow remaining upright. The only movement I could manage was the shallow rise and fall of my chest, each breath a monumental effort that sent fresh ice crystals spiraling from my lips. The procession continued its impossible circuit below, but now I began to notice changes in the rhythm. The steps were coming faster, more urgent, and the scraping from the casket had taken on a frantic quality. Whatever was inside that box was becoming agitated, desperate to get out, or maybe desperate to bring something else in. That's when I heard my name. It came from below, carried on the voice of the thing that wore my face. The sound was muffled by the casket's lid, distorted by distance and the ice-covered glass, but unmistakably my name spoken in my own voice. The recognition sent a bolt of pure terror through me, so intense it momentarily overwhelmed even the fever's heat. The voice called again, and this time I could make out more words. It was speaking to me, using my voice to form sentences I couldn't quite understand. The meaning hovered just beyond comprehension, like a word balanced on the tip of your tongue that refuses to surface. But I knew, with the certainty that comes only in nightmares and fever dreams, that if I could understand what it was saying, everything would change. Some fundamental truth about reality would be revealed, and I would never be the same again. The ice on the windows began to crack. It started as hairline fractures spreading outward from the corners, but quickly grew into a network of fissures that traced impossible geometries across the glass. The patterns were too complex, too perfect to be natural. They looked like circuit boards or neural networks, as if the ice were trying to form some kind of communication system. Through the cracks, I could see that the procession had stopped circling. The pallbearers stood motionless in a perfect circle around my building's base, their hooded heads tilted up toward my window. The casket rested in the center of their formation, and from it came a steady stream of that soft, scraping sound. The thing inside was trying to claw its way out, but that was impossible. The thing was already outside, walking among the pallbearers, wearing my face like a costume. How could it be both inside the casket and outside simultaneously? The contradiction made my head spin, adding another layer of impossibility to a situation that had already transcended logic. Unless there were two of them, or more. The thought sent fresh waves of nausea through me. If there was one thing wearing my face, why not dozens? Hundreds, an entire army of perfect duplicates. Each one slightly wrong in its own unique way, all of them converging on my building for purposes I couldn't begin to fathom. The ice on the window shattered all at once. The sound was like thunder compressed into a single instant, so loud and sudden that it knocked me backward onto the hardwood floor. Shards of ice rained down around me, each piece striking the floor with a musical chime that seemed to resonate in frequencies beyond normal hearing. But through the now empty window frame, I could see that the courtyard was empty. No procession, no casket, no hooded figures, just empty concrete and the usual detritus of urban life. A few scattered leaves, a forgotten coffee cup, the ordinary shadows of ordinary things. The silence was the normal silence of a weekday afternoon, not the oppressive void that had surrounded the mysterious gathering. I lay on the floor, my fever breaking at last, sweat cooling on my skin as my temperature finally began to return to normal. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, as if I'd been holding my breath for hours and could finally exhale. The apartment warmed quickly without the supernatural cold, and within minutes, the whole experience began to feel like exactly what it probably was, a fever dream brought on by 3 days of illness. But as I struggled to my feet, Something crunched under my heel. I looked down to see a small piece of ice, already melting into a puddle on the hardwood floor. But the ice on the windows had been inside, and this piece was different, darker, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As I watched, it finished melting, leaving behind a stain on the wood that looked disturbingly like a handprint. A small handprint, the size of a child's. I stared at that mark for a long time, my rational mind struggling to find an explanation that didn't involve supernatural visitations or impossible processions. Water stains could take any shape after all. Pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns where none existed, was a well-documented phenomenon. People saw faces in clouds, heard voices in static, found meaning in random coincidence. But as I turned away from the stain, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Just for an instant, reflected in the black screen of my television, I saw a small figure standing behind me. When I spun around, the room was empty, but the impression lingered, the sense of being watched by something that wore my face but wasn't me. The fever was gone, but the questions it had raised remained. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to the window again and again, searching the courtyard for signs of the impossible procession. The rational part of my mind insisted it had all been hallucination, but deeper instincts whispered otherwise. And sometimes, late at night, when the building settled into its deepest quiet, I could swear I heard the soft scraping of fingernails against wood, coming from somewhere just below the threshold of hearing. The sound of something trying to claw its way out of a box that might or might not exist, in a world that might or might not be real. The handprint on the floor never fully faded, no matter how much I scrubbed at it. And every morning when I woke, I found myself checking the mirror with growing anxiety, making sure the reflection that looked back was truly my own. Because somewhere out there, in the space between fever dreams and waking nightmares, something wearing my face was still walking, still pointing, still leading its impossible procession through courtyards that existed in the corners of reality, where logic fears to tread. And someday, I know with absolute certainty, it will find its way back to my window. The only question that remains is whether I'll be ready when it does. Story 3. The first call came 3 weeks after I'd blocked her number. I stared at my phone screen, watching the unfamiliar digits pulse with each ring. Area code 570, somewhere in Pennsylvania. The automated voice had told me once when I'd looked it up out of curiosity. I'd never been to Pennsylvania, had never wanted to go either. The endless forests and small towns held no appeal for someone who'd grown up under the sprawling concrete of Los Angeles. But there it was, 570-413-8847, calling at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I almost didn't answer. Should have let it go to voicemail like any reasonable person would with an unknown number at that hour. Instead, some stubborn part of me, the same part that had finally confronted Sarah about her increasingly erratic behavior, picked up on the fourth ring. Silence. Not the empty silence of a dropped call, but the weighted quiet of someone holding their breath on the other end. I could feel the presence there, patient and listening, like a spider waiting at the center of its web. "Hello?" I said, my voice sharper than intended. The breathing began then, slow, deliberate inhalations that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. Not heavy or threatening, but somehow worse, measured and purposeful, as if each breath carried meaning I wasn't equipped to understand. I hung up and tried to forget about it. The calls continued for 2 weeks. Always the same time, always the same number, always the same careful breathing that made my skin crawl. I stopped answering after the third night, but the phone kept ringing anyway, the pale glow of the screen cutting through my bedroom darkness like an accusation. Then came the night she spoke. I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the October wind rattle my apartment windows, when the phone began its familiar vibration against the nightstand. The blue light painted shadows across the wall, and I found myself reaching for it before I could stop myself. "What do you want?" I whispered into the receiver, my throat dry. The breathing paused. For a moment, I thought the connection had died. Then, barely audible above the static, "We're still scouts." The line went dead. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice had been Sarah's. I was certain of it. The same slight rasp she'd developed after years of smoking. The same way she dropped the G on present participles. But Sarah lived in Oregon now. Had moved there 6 months ago after our friendship had finally, irreparably cracked. And her voice had carried something else. Something that made my teeth ache, just remembering it. The next morning I called the number back. It rang once before connecting to an automated message informing me that the number was not in service. Had never been in service, would never be in service. Please check the number and try again. But I had the number memorized by then. Every digit burned into my memory like a brand. Work became difficult to focus on. I found myself checking my phone constantly, scrolling through the call log to confirm the numbers were still there. My supervisor noticed my distraction during meetings, the way I jumped whenever anyone's phone rang. The marketing department's open floor plan, once comfortable and collaborative, began to feel exposed. Too many sounds. Too many people who might be watching me without my knowledge. I started leaving early, making excuses about dentist appointments and family obligations that didn't exist. My apartment felt safer, more controllable. I could monitor every sound, every shadow that moved across the walls. The calls evolved. Sometimes she would whisper other phrases before hanging up. "Remember the friendship circle? Honor system still applies. Baden-Powell is watching." References to our brief stint in Boy Scouts during middle school. Those awkward months when our parents had forced us into khaki uniforms and endless merit badge workshops. I'd forgotten most of it. The camping trips that reeked of mosquito spray and adolescent sweat. The knot-tying exercises that left our fingers raw. The way the older scouts would tell ghost stories around dying campfires while somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other in voices that sounded almost human. But Sarah remembered everything. She always had. During our friendship, she'd bring up those scouting days with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The way her eyes would go distant when she talked about the oath we'd taken, the promises we'd made to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful. She spoke about it like a religion, a sacred covenant that transcended the awkward reality of what it had actually been. A few dozen preteens stumbling through outdoor activities they mostly hated. I'd tried to explain this to her once, the last time we'd spoken in person. We'd been sitting in her cramped studio apartment, surrounded by the conspiracy boards she'd been constructing for months. Red yarn connecting newspaper clippings, printed emails, photographs of people I didn't recognize. She'd been convinced that our old scoutmaster, Mr. Henley, was part of some larger network. Something about missing campers, unexplained disappearances in national forests, connections that only she could see. The conversation had spiraled quickly. She'd accused me of breaking faith, of abandoning the brotherhood, of being complicit in something I couldn't even comprehend. Her voice had risen to a pitch that made the neighbors bang on the thin walls, and I'd left knowing I couldn't maintain the friendship anymore. Now, listening to her whispered words through my phone speaker, I wondered if I'd been too hasty. The breathing calls began coming during the day. My phone would buzz in the middle of client presentations, during lunch meetings, while I was trying to concentrate on budget reports. Always the same number, always the same patient silence followed by careful exhalations that seemed to know exactly when I was most vulnerable. I changed my number. The calls followed me to the new one within hours. I bought a different phone. Same result. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening for the telltale vibration, my nerves stretched so tight that every sound, the building settling, pipes creaking, distant traffic, would send adrenaline shooting through my system. The darkness outside my windows seemed to press closer each night, as if something vast and patient was slowly contracting around me. During the day, I started noticing things, small details that might have been coincidence but felt like messages. A discarded merit badge handbook in the gutter outside my building. A man in khaki clothing who seemed to be in every coffee shop I visited. The smell of campfire smoke drifting through my apartment vents, despite living on the 8th floor of a downtown building. I researched the area code obsessively. 570 covered northeastern Pennsylvania, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, the Pocono Mountains. Rural areas where cell towers were sparse and landlines were still common. I studied maps until my eyes burned, looking for some connection, some reason why that particular region would be reaching out to me across the continent. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night in late November. I'd been sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open to another fruitless search, when the phone rang. This time, instead of the usual immediate breathing, there was background noise. Wind through trees, the distant sound of running water, and underneath it all, a low humming that might have been singing. When Sarah's voice came, it was clearer than it had ever been. "The promise still binds us," she said. "Distance doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter. You know what you have to do." "Sarah," I managed. "Where are you? What is this about?" But the line had already gone dead. I stared at my phone, my hands trembling. In the silence that followed, I became aware of a new sound, a soft tapping against my windows. I looked up to see nothing but my own reflection staring back from the black glass, but the tapping continued, rhythmic, patient, like Morse code. I approached the window slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. 8 floors below, the street was empty except for the occasional passing car. But as I pressed my face to the glass, I could swear I saw movement in the shadows between buildings. A figure in what might have been a uniform, standing perfectly still among the urban darkness. The tapping stopped. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night researching Sarah's current whereabouts, using every social media platform and people search engine I could find. The results were contradictory and strange. Her Oregon address was listed as vacant. Her phone number had been disconnected for months. There were no recent posts on any of her accounts, no trace of her digital presence beyond a certain date in September. It was as if she had simply evaporated, but the calls kept coming. They grew bolder, more intrusive. Sometimes the phone would ring while I was in the shower, and when I emerged, dripping and desperate, I'd find missed call notifications from numbers I'd never seen before, all with the same 570 area code, all connecting to the same automated message about non-existent services. I started keeping a log, writing down every call time, every whispered phrase, every strange detail I could remember. The patterns that emerged made no sense, but felt significant nonetheless. The calls always came in clusters of 3. They always lasted exactly 47 seconds. The background sounds grew more distinct each time. I could now clearly hear what sounded like multiple voices humming in harmony, accompanied by the crackle of a campfire. My work performance deteriorated completely. I was placed on administrative leave after falling asleep during a board meeting and waking up to find myself drawing merit badge symbols in the margins of important documents. The forced time off should have